Boarding party. My story begins right at the beginning of the Second World War. I was doing my R&R training when war broke out. So I wasn't even called up, I was just kept on. And my first appointment was to HMS Renown, a large battle cruiser, 6 15-inch guns, and a crew of 120, of a crew of 1,200 people. Our first job on HMS Renown, shortly after war broke out, was to go to the South Atlantic with the Ark Royal and search for the Graf Spee, which was sinking a lot of our merchant ships at the beginning of the war. Before war broke out, of course, there were many German merchant ships scattered all over the high seas, going about their business on their lawful occasions and so on. But at 11 o'clock on September the 3rd, 1939, these German merchant ships became enemy merchant ships, and immediately they found themselves in a very invidious position. They were right out on a limb, fed up, far from home, and they only had two options. One was to make for the nearest neutral port and hold up there, or attempt the much harder task of trying to get back to Germany. But whatever these German merchant ships were, whether they were a large passenger vessel, oil tanker, or general cargo ship, they all had one thing in common. They all had strict orders from Adolf in Berlin not to allow themselves to be caught, to be captured by the Royal Navy. If they were intercepted by the Royal Navy, they were to make quite sure that they scuttled themselves so that we could not have the use of their ships. And the Germans became quite professional, quite adept at scuttling their ships. Perhaps the best known, of course, was the Graf Spee herself, who scuttled herself after the Battle of the River Plate. But many German merchant ships scuttled themselves too before they could be taken over by the Royal Navy. Well, having a job like searching for the Graf Spee, covering vast miles of the ocean with the Ark Royal, it was very possible, of course, that we should sight odd merchant ships. And so, being a merchant navy officer, I suppose I was a natural to be picked as the boarding officer. And so it came to pass. The captain called me up onto the bridge one day and said, "You are the boarding officer." So the first thing you have to do, having got yourself the job as boarding officer, is to pick a crew, a boarding crew. Well, it's quite easy to do this, but there is a difference of opinion. You see, if you do get aboard an enemy merchant ship, it is quite possible that it will be weeks or even months before you rejoin your parent ship, because there will be a parting of the ways, and you'll go one way and your parent ship will go the other, and goodness knows when you'll meet up again. And the parent ship doesn't want to lose all its best men. On the other hand, you want to get the best men you can. So you go along to the heads of department and you say you want 6 seaman rating or 4 engine room ratings or whatever, and he will pick up his pencil and he will look at his crew list and he will say, "Well, he's useless, you can have him. Don't mind if I never see him again, you can have him." And so on, until your boarding crew is complete. And if you think those two phrases he's useless, you can have him. Don't mind if I never see him again, you can have him, fell rather glibly from my lips. You're quite right, because they are the exact words he used when he was picking my boarding party. And I remember too, the last thing he said as he looked at the list, he said, "Good Lord, I can't let you go with just that lot. Here, have Leading Seaman Bright Eyes," that wasn't his real name, "have Leading Seaman Bright Eyes, he's a good man, he'll see you all right." And so my boarding party was complete. 13 and myself made 14. And having got your boarding party picked, there's not much more you can do, because it's not the sort of job that you can exercise. It's not like gunnery or torpedoes where you can exercise all day long and make sure you're thoroughly efficient, because you can't stop every merchant ship you see and say, "Hang on, I want to exercise my boarding party." So there's nothing very much you can do about it, except to make sure they realize that the speed of boarding is paramount. Get aboard as soon as you can if you do meet an enemy merchant ship, so as to prevent them from scuttling, or at least get aboard so that you can do something about it if they've already done the damage. And so having done that, there's not much else you can do. You just pack a little bag with a toothbrush and a pair of socks and await the day, rather like an expectant mum waiting for the call, except in our case, the boarding party, you never know if you're going or when. I boarded several ships during the first few months of the war. The first one I boarded was one of those amazing coincidences which occasionally happen as you go through life. We were 300 miles south of the Cape of Good Hope at the time, looking for the Graf Spee, right down in the Southern Ocean, and the captain called me up on the bridge and said, "What do you make of that ship?" And we were close alongside a cargo ship, and I looked at her, and I said, "She's the Trojan Star." He said, "How do you know?" I said, "Well, it's my last ship. I've only just left her." He said, "Well, that's who she says she is, but it's most suspicious. We have no record of her at all. According to our record, she shouldn't be here. Perhaps it's a ship in disguise. You'd better go aboard and check her over." So away boarding party, and we went over to see her. Well, I climbed up the rope ladder. Of course, I knew who she was. After all, you do know your last ship. I climbed up the ladder, and as soon as my face appeared over the gunwale, the chief officer nearly fell over backwards when he saw me, called me all the rude names he could name too, stopping his ship in the middle of the ocean and so on and so forth, and then said, "Come up to see the old man, we must have a drink on this." So I went up to the captain's cabin, and I was enjoying a glass of beer when a most abrupt signal from Renown came along. "Why are you taking so long? Return immediately." So I hurriedly downed my glass of beer and hurried back to Renown. I mention that story just because it's one of these coincidences which do occur, and of course it must surely be unique for a sub-lieutenant R&R, which I was at the time, one of the lowest forms of marine growth, to keep a big capital ship waiting while he enjoys a glass of beer. It's just one of those things which just does happen. The second ship I boarded was a week or two later, November the 5th, 1939, an easy date to remember. My boarding party was now farmed out to a destroyer, because it is easier to do any boarding from a destroyer than from a capital ship like Renown. So I and my boarding party were now on board HMS Hereward, and we were still searching for the Graf Spee when one of Ark Royal's planes reported that she'd sighted a merchant ship about 50 miles away, and we Hereward was instructed to go and check her over. So off we went at 30 knots in the direction of where this ship had been reported. I was on the bridge with the captain of the destroyer when the ship was sighted, and after a while the captain said, "What do you make of her?" I said, "Well, I think she's German." Well, now, of course, when you've been at sea for a few years, as I had, in those days at least, ships did look different. A British ship, it looked like a British ship, and a Japanese ship looked like a Japanese ship, and a German ship just looked like a German ship, and an American ship looked horrible. That's what they were there. All ships look a bit horrible now, container ships and so on, but in those days they looked a bit different. And I said, "I think she's a German." And as we got a bit closer, the captain, who was looking at her through his telescope, said, "Oh, she's hoisted the Stars and Stripes. She's an American." I said, "No, I think she's a German ship." And when we got right up close to her, of course we were doing a big speed, we were doing 30 knots. When we got close to her, the American ensign was hauled down, and she hoisted the German swastika, and they abandoned ship. They all took to the lifeboats and left the ship. Well, I stayed on the bridge of the destroyer until the last minute, and then I went down to get into the seaboat. My boarding party were already in it. Now, the davits were swung out, but the boat was bowsed in so that you could get aboard easily. I jumped aboard, and before I had a chance to sit down, two trigger-happy able seamen slipped the gripes. The boat went out with a run. I turned a complete somersault and landed in the sea. I think my guardian angel must have been working overtime that day, because I fell between the boat and the ship. And an interested spectator told me a long time later that my head had missed Hereward's gunwale by a cigarette paper as I went down. So there I was, sploshing around in the sea. A jolly good start to a boarding episode. All I could think of as I was sploshing around there was speed of boarding is paramount, and here was me swimming in the water. Not only that, I was not dressed for the occasion. It's all right swimming in a bathing costume, but swimming in your full boarding rig, I had everything on me. I had a revolver and a cutlass and a haversack and a water bottle, and you name it, I got it, and it's not so easy to swim. But in any case, all I could think of was speed of boarding is paramount. Someone threw me a rope, and I got fished back on board Hereward, splashed up amidships where I found the boat was already in the water, slopped down into the boat, and off we went. I don't think all that much time was lost, but anyhow, it wasn't a very good start to boarding an enemy merchant ship. On the way across, we hadn't far to go, but on the way across I remember thinking such thoughts as, "No, keep calm, big moment, don't forget this and that." And then I thought, oh, of course, the bullets in my revolver are sopping wet, so I ejected these 6 sopping wet bullets and reloaded with 6 equally sopping wet bullets from my spare supply, which is one of those stupid things that you do. We had no trouble in getting aboard the ship, because the side was liberally festooned with rope ladders from where the Germans had abandoned her. So I got aboard, and just in time to stop the last 2 crew members from leaving. They were about to leave from the other side of the ship in the last boat. That was the captain and the chief engineer. They agreed to stay on board, and then, of course, my first thing was to get down the engine room to see what damage they'd done. We had torches, of course, everything was in the pitch darkness, but we had torches. Went down the engine room. By the time I was expecting to find the water over the bed plates by the time I got down there, but no, everything seemed to be perfectly all right. No water sloshing around. And the first place I went to examine was the tail end shaft. Right at the end of the shaft tunnel where the propeller shaft goes out into the water, because that is where I would place an explosive charge if I wanted to do the utmost damage to a ship. Got there, no, everything seemed perfectly all right. No peculiar packages, no wires, no ticking clocks, everything perfectly sound. So back to the engine room and had a look at the main condenser inlet, which is another vulnerable point. Perfectly all right, everything seemed all right. Into the boiler room, perfectly all right, no water, no signs of any damage, so this was splendid. So I went back to the bridge where my signalman was waiting, and I made a signal to HMS Hereward by Alderslamp, by flashing. I remember exactly the signal I sent. I sent SS Euenfels, because that was the ship's name, SS Euenfels, Lourenço Marques to Hamburg. Lourenço Marques was in Portuguese East Africa, a neutral port, of course, where she had been, and she was trying to get back to Hamburg. Lourenço Marques, Portuguese East Africa, is now Mozambique, and Lourenço Marques is now Maputo, or some such thing. But anyhow, that was the signal I made. Then I said, engine room and boiler rooms dry. Consider that with crew we can make Freetown. So that was the signal that I sent to Hereward. SS Euenfels, Lourenço Marques to Hamburg, engine and boiler rooms dry. Consider that with crew we can make Freetown. Now we were standing out in the wing of the starboard wing of the bridge while my signalman sent that message over, and I happened to look aft, and I got quite a shock. But a pleasant shock, a very nice shock, because flying from the ensign staff aft was the white ensign above or superior to the German swastika. And you know, that made me feel good, because it was so unexpected. I hadn't thought of anything like that. But my signalman, of course, he'd brought over a white ensign with him. Hadn't bothered to mention such an obvious bit of routine to me. And the first thing he'd done, while I was mucking about down the engine room, was to hold down the German flag, bend on the white ensign, with the German flag underneath it, and hoist the two together on the ensign staff. A universally recognized signal of a captured ship. And as I say, that made me feel good. Then I noticed the German captain who was standing by my side. He was also looking aft. But what he saw, of course, meant something very, very different to him. It told him more plainly than any words that he was really just a prisoner in his own ship. It told him that all his plans and hopes for the future had just come tumbling down like a house of cards. And on his face was a look which I hope I never have to see again. It was a look of complete despair. And as one mariner to another, I felt very sorry for him. It was a nasty position for him to be in. Well, Hereward's reply to my signal I've always looked upon as a splendid example of brevity and clarity. It consisted of two words: recall crew. So I said to the German captain, recall crew. And he said, well, no, it's not worth it. This ship is sinking. She's sinking slowly, but she's sinking, and it's not worth bringing the crew back. I said, well, sir, over there says recall the crew, so we'd better recall them. So the captain went over and blew several short blasts on his whistle, on the ship's siren, and the 4 lifeboats, which were lying off, started to pull back to the ship. I didn't know it at the time, but I gather Hereward also encouraged them to return to the ship by several bursts of machine gun fire, not at the boats, but in their general vicinity, just to ensure that they knew we meant business and they were to return to the ship. So they started to pull back. I was tempted at this stage to abandon those boats, because I thought if we hadn't got any lifeboats, they might be more encouraged to keep the ship afloat. But my mercenary training in the Blue Star Line, I couldn't leave these 4 well-found, good lifeboats drifting around with no one in them, so we did hoist them up. Well, of course, it's a long business, manhandling 4 heavy lifeboats and get them up, stowed away safely on the davits and chocks. But eventually it was all finished and we were ready to go. The captain said, "Can I speak to the ship's company before we get underway?" So I said, "Yes, of course." So he mustered all the ship's company and he spoke to them. He spoke to them in German, so I didn't understand what he said at all. But he told me that he told them to obey my orders to avoid bloodshed. They were to obey my orders to avoid bloodshed. So then they were dispersed and we got underway and set our course for Freetown, which was our nearest port. Hereward had to go off and resume her escorting duties of Renown and Ark Royal. Well, it was getting late by this time. It was about 6 o'clock, getting dark, and off we went to Freetown. Well, round about 8 o'clock, it was pitch dark now, the ship was beginning to get a list, and this was worrying me quite a bit. Of course, the list was increasing, so obviously something was wrong somewhere. I knew it wasn't in the engine room, that was all right. So it was high time I inspected the whole ship. So I got hold of the German carpenter, and we started at number 1 hold, the most forward hold. Knocked the wedges out, turned the tarpaulin back, lifted the hatch, and the cargo was right up to the top. The number 1 was absolutely full of cargo. So if there was anything wrong down there, there wasn't a thing I could do about it. So I went along to number 2 hatch. Now number 2 hatch was just forward of the bridge, and it was the main hatch of the ship. Very large hatch indeed, fitted with a jumbo derrick, and outward bound they used to take railway engines and railway carriages and big stuff like that. So it was a very big hatch. Went to the forward end of this hatch, knocked the wedges out, and then a German officer who was on the bridge shouted something in German to the German carpenter, who stopped what he was doing and went to the after end of the hatch. Immediately, of course, I knew this is where I was going to find the trouble. So, went to the after end of the hatch, knocked the wedges out, pulled the tarpaulin back, lifted the hatch, and it was absolutely full of cargo. But being so suspicious, I was just able to get my head inside and flash my torch along, and I could see that the forward end of the hatch was not full. So back to the forward end of the hatch again with the German carpenter, knocked the wedges out, pulled the tarpaulin back, lifted the hatch, and I could see right down to the lower hold. The lower hold had cargo in it, that the ceiling was covered, but you could see right down to the lower hold. So I obviously had to go down there, but the first thing I noticed was there was no obvious way of getting down. The normal way of getting into a cargo hatch is by a vertical iron ladder, but this had been removed by the Germans. So, as I say, there was no obvious way of getting down, but of course there's always plenty of rope in a merchant ship, and so I got a rope, threw it down, was just about to slide down the rope when I thought, that's a bit stupid, and the passing German seaman agreed to go down first. You know, I get a bit claustrophobic. I had a sudden vision of myself down there on my own, and then the Germans shutting me in and taking the ship over. And I felt much safer with a German down there with me. Well, as I slid down the rope, as soon as I got my head inside the hatch, I could hear water sloshing around. And I slid right down to the lower hold, and immediately I could see what had happened. I will try and explain in simple language just what the Germans had done in their endeavour to scuttle the Eulenfels. Now, all ships have two bottoms, an inner bottom and an outer bottom. And the space between these two bottoms is made up of tanks, divided up into tanks. And these tanks are extremely useful to a ship, and they can be used for a number of reasons. They can be used to carry your fresh water. They can be used to carry your oil fuel. They can be filled with seawater for ballast, or then they can be kept empty. But of course, in a completely enclosed tank, like a double-bottomed tank, you cannot fill it unless there is a means of the air escaping. So all these double-bottomed tanks are fitted with what we call breathing pipes, which are just pipes which go from the tank right up the ship's side and end on the upper deck in the form of a gooseneck. You'll see them on any ship you go on. These goosenecks up in the scuppers, and all they are the breathing pipes, the air pipes, which allow you the air to enter into the tank when you are emptying it, and alternatively to let the air out when you are filling the tank. Well, what the Germans had done, when the ship had left Lorento Marx, number 2 double-bottom tanks were empty. So they cut the breathing pipes low down in the ship's hold, one on the port side, one on the starboard side, which was quite safe because the tank was empty. But the last thing they had done before they abandoned ship, they turned the flooding valve on in the engine room to flood number 2 bottom tanks. The water dashed into the tanks, up the breathing pipes, and the breathing pipes, which were now cut, from the breathing pipes into the lower hold itself. This very big hold which number 2 was. Then, before they left, they smashed the valve with heavy hammers so that it could not be turned off. You couldn't turn the water off. So the water was now coming into the number 2 double-bottom tanks, up the breathing pipes, and then into this very, very large lower hold. And the Germans had calculated, and I had no doubt they were right, that if the number 2 hatch was flooded, it would be sufficient to capsize the ship and sink her. They had covered the broken pipes, the cut pipes, with cargo, heaps of cargo, one each side, one on the port side, one on the starboard side. Now, of course, this was so easy for me, being a merchant navy officer. It was my life to stow cargo and to crawl over cargo hatches and so on and so on. And they had covered these broken pipes with 2 heaps of cargo. Well, you don't have heaps of cargo on a ship if you're going on an ocean passage. Everything has to be leveled off. And if they put huge arrows saying, look here, it couldn't have been more plain to me. And it's interesting to think that to a Royal Navy officer who'd never been on a merchant ship at all, it wouldn't have been so easy for him. Anyhow, I called the rest of my boarding party down straight away. They came down. We just pulled the cargo aside, which was covering the broken pipes, and then it was quite easy to plug the pipes, because the water was only coming in by gravity. It wasn't terrific pressure, and we shoved all sorts of stuff down these pipes with heavy hammers and stopped the water from coming in. So that was a good thing. And my sigh of relief, I think, must have echoed around the South Atlantic for some time. Well, we had a list, but it wasn't a serious list, about 7 or 8 degrees, something like that, and we were still going on towards Freetown. So, as I say, that was very relieved when I found just what the trouble was. Well, the next thing that happened, about 3 o'clock in the morning, I was on the bridge, and I heard a rifle shot on the afterdeck, followed by shouting. Now, this was quite terrible, because this could only mean, I thought, an attempt to recapture the ship, because after all, we were only 14 and there were about 70 of them, and this rifle shot and shouting could only mean an attempt to recapture the ship, which is what I thought. And then I heard footsteps running towards the bridge. And Well, feeling very embarrassed, I drew my revolver and I thought, well, I suppose the first chap up the bridge ladder gets shot. But as the footsteps got nearer, I could hear them accompanied by the most fearful oaths and swear words it's possible to imagine. But they were English oaths, English swear words. Whoever was coming up the bridge ladder wasn't a German. Of course, no German could swear like that in English. And up the bridge ladder came leading seaman Bright Eyes, still swearing profusely. Bloody fool, shouldn't be allowed to carry a rifle. Blood was streaming down his arm, and I said, what's the matter, leading seaman, what's happened? He said, ordinary seaman Muggins on the afterdeck, he's shot me. Bloody fool, he shouldn't be allowed to carry a rifle. Well, when he soothed down quietly, and I got the story of just what had happened. Ordinary leading seaman Bright Eyes, like the good leading seaman he was going round with mugs of cocoa for the sentries. And as he approached with the proffered mug to ordinary seaman Muggins on the afterdeck, ordinary seaman Muggins was apparently swinging the rifle to and fro idly with his finger in the trigger guard. Not surprisingly, the rifle had gone off, and it had shot the mug of cocoa out of the leading seaman's hand. A splinter from the mug had grazed his upper arm, and that was all. It was a scratch, a lot of blood, but nothing very serious, nothing that the first aid box couldn't attend to, but that was perhaps the start of how we were reaping the rather bitter fruits of how the boarding party was looked. Ordinary seaman Muggins was not being very clever. I will now break the chronological order of my story in order to follow the career of ordinary seaman Muggins a little further. The next afternoon I was doing my round of the ship, which I frequently did all the time I was on board her. When I reached the afterdeck, there was no sentry. There just was no sentry at all. But outside the loo door was a rifle, and inside, yes, you guessed it, was ordinary seaman Muggins. Well, even to me, untrained as I was in the arts of war, this did seem to me a bit much. I mean, first of all, he goes and shoots up my leading seaman, and then he does a damn silly thing like that. So, when we did get back to civilization, and I had the awful business of writing reports in triplicate and swearing affidavits and goodness knows what, I mentioned in my reports the misdemeanors of ordinary seaman Muggins. And of course, when this sort of got around renown, there was a little bit of chuckling going on and nudging, damn fool, fancy doing a stupid thing like that and shooting the leading seaman and so on. But suddenly everyone stopped laughing, and it wasn't funny anymore, because when the legal boys got hold of this, apparently it's quite all right to shoot leading seamen in the middle of the night. You've done nothing wrong there. That's quite all right. I never really understood why, but perhaps getting shot is an accepted occupational hazard of being a leading seaman. But the other, that was very different. He wasn't accused of relieving himself or going to the loo whilst on sentry duty. He was accused of abandoning his post in the presence of the enemy. We were at war, and the penalty for that is, or can be, death. So it wasn't funny. And in the fullness of time, a court-martial was arranged, and ordinary seaman Muggins was brought before the court under armed escort, a Royal Marine on each side of him, and so charged. Well, not only was I the principal witness, I was the only witness, and the prisoner's friend very soon had me up in the witness box, where I had a most uncomfortable 10 minutes or so. It went something like this. Sub-Lieutenant Pierce, tell me, what written instructions did you give your sentries before they were posted? None. I see. Then, in the absence of written instructions, what verbal instructions did you give your sentries before they were posted? Oh, I told them to keep a good lookout. Any funny business, they were to shoot to kill. Good, good. Please continue. That's all. And similar sort of questions, until it became obvious to me that ordinary Seaman Muggins was completely innocent of any ill-doing, and the real culprit was undoubtedly Sub-Lieutenant Pierce, whose gross incapacity and mishandling of the whole situation had brought about the whole occurrence. I was quite expecting the armed guard to leave ordinary Seaman Muggins and start escorting me. But anyhow, all things come to an end, and ordinary Seaman Muggins was found guilty, but he wasn't shot on the quarterdeck nor strung to the yardarm. But he was given 90 days in the ship's cells, which I suppose is a rather heavy price to pay for something which shouldn't have cost more than a penny. However, let us now return to Renown, where we were continuing our rather halting and stumbling way towards Freetown. The next morning, at sunrise, I went up to Monkey Island, to the standard compass, to take an amplitude of the sun, to see what the error of the compass was, to check the error of the compass. This is the normal routine when you're at sea, because the sunrise is a very convenient time to take an amplitude. When I got there, I found the binnacle door open, and all the magnets had been removed from the compass, the standard compass, the main compass on the ship, so that it was completely useless. But that didn't worry me a little bit, for two reasons. First, Africa is a very big place. It's difficult to miss, even if you're vaguely steering towards it. And second, and much more important, they couldn't touch the steering compass in the wheelhouse, because there was always a sentry in the wheelhouse, and that compass was perfectly all right. So I didn't worry about that at all. Later on that morning, I discovered that they had removed all the nautical almanacs from the chart room, so that I couldn't get the ship's position by any astronomical means, because there were no nautical almanacs, which you must have if you're going to take a sight of the sun or stars. But again, that didn't worry me at all, because I knew where we were, and I doubt if I would have taken a sight even if the nautical almanacs were there. Later on again, I discovered that the charts of Freetown and its approaches had been removed from the chart folio. So I had no charts of Freetown, but again, that didn't worry me, because I'd been in and out of Freetown several times, and there was no, I knew I could get in without any trouble there as well. After breakfast, I decided I'd try and get some of the water pumped out of number 2 lower hold, because there was 6 feet of water in that hold, and that's rather a lot of water to have sloshing around in your ship. So I went down the engine room and saw the chief engineer and said, let's get some of this water pumped out of number 2 lower hold. But he didn't think that was a good idea. He said it wasn't his duty to pump the water out, it was his duty to sink the ship, and he shouldn't be asked to pump the water out like that. I said I was asking him to, and he'd better do something about it. So eventually, with very bad grace and much delay, he started a pump and turned a valve or two, and I thought, good-o, and I went up to the deck and looked over the side, and saw an encouraging stream of water being pumped out, and I thought, that's splendid, and then I went back to the bridge. Then I began to feel something wasn't right. You know, you get that feeling sometimes that something was wrong somewhere, and I didn't know what it was, and it's very annoying. You know, you will scratch the back of your neck and want to stamp your foot, and something wasn't right somewhere, and I couldn't think what it was. But I was walking up and down the bridge for 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, something like that, and I went over to the port side and looked over the wing of the bridge again, looked over the ship's side, and there the water was still being pumped out, and then suddenly the penny dropped. The water which was being pumped out was perfectly clear, crystal clear water, and if he'd been pumping out number 2 lower hold, it should have been filthy stuff. So back I went to the engine room again, and now we really had to be quite rude to the chief engineer. I told him he wasn't pumping out number 2 lower hold, and he'd better do something about it right away. I had 2 very good engine room ratings down there to help me, petty officers, but of course it was a strange engine room to them, and all the labels were in German, so they couldn't really do very much about it. But anyhow, after a while, the chief engineer, did turn a few more valves, and I went up on deck again, and I saw a dirty stream of brown water being pumped out, and I knew that he was actually then pumping out number 2 lower hold. As a matter of fact, we didn't get much water out, because after a while the strum boxes got choked up with dirt, and I couldn't get down to clear them, but I got some water pumped out, and that was better than none at all. I forgot to mention, we did have one lady passenger on board. A German lady was no doubt thumbing a lift back to Germany. I know it would be a nice embellishment to my story if I could report that she was a blue-eyed, fair-haired Fräulein who tried to lure me from my duty with seductive encouragement and so on and so forth, but alas no. Besides, she was very old. She must have been in her middle 30s, and of course at that stage in my career, anyone over 30, well, I mean, you'd really had it, you were a bit beyond it. But we did have this lady passenger. She'd shinned up and down rope ladders and took part in everything. There were 2 other men passengers too, but they didn't cause us any trouble at all. There were 3 quite separate incidents, I remember, about that voyage, even after all these years. The first happened at breakfast on the first morning that I was aboard her. I had my meals in the saloon on my own after all the German officers had had their meal, and I was served by a German steward. And at breakfast on that first morning, the porridge tasted terrible, horrible, and immediately I thought, they're trying to dope me. There's some dope in this porridge. They're trying to poison me. And so I sent it back. The bacon and eggs which followed were perfectly all right, but I've often wondered about that. That porridge really did taste terrible, and I was quite sure at the time that the Germans were trying to poison me. But since then, I've often wondered, perhaps I was doing the Germans an injustice. Perhaps all German porridge tastes horrible. But at the time, I was quite sure that they were trying to poison me. And the second incident happened also when I was having lunch one day, my solitary lunch, and of course all this happened in the tropics. It was very hot, and I was very hot. I was also terribly dirty and scruffy. After all, I'd started off in a nice clean white uniform. I'd been for a swim in it. I'd crawled over cargo holds. I'd swum. I'd gone up and down ropes. I'd been in and out of the engine room continually. I was filthy. I was tired. because I was in a position where I felt I couldn't go to sleep, and I was really scruffy, and carrying a big service revolver around on you for 24 hours a day didn't help. So whenever I thought it was safe, I took the damn thing off. And I was having my solitary lunch one day, and the revolver was lying on the settee by my side, when suddenly I realized with awful clarity that the steward was as close to the revolver as I was. And I knew that he knew. And I knew that he knew that I knew that he knew. And the telepathy which was going on between us was nobody's business, and we were both absolutely motionless. I was too embarrassed to grab the thing, and the world stopped. Everything was just stopped and silent. You could have heard a pin drop, and I knew just what he was thinking. And then I saw his shoulders drop, and he picked up my plate, and he walked out of the back to the pantry. And my sigh of relief must have echoed round the South Atlantic. And when he came back, the offending implement had been removed. But it was a very tense moment. And now, whenever I read in a book that hackneyed phrase like, the two men froze, or the air was electric, well, I think of lunchtime on Ewenfels, and I know that it can happen. And the third little incident happened on the last night that I was on board her, the night before we arrived. The ship's speed had dropped right down to 4 knots. We were rapidly getting nowhere, and I knew why. There was the pressure in the boilers was dropping all the time. The revolutions were dropping, so our speed was dropping, and I knew why. The firemen had gone on strike. They were just sitting down and weren't tending the fires at all. And I had every sympathy with the firemen. After all, we were asking a bit much of them to keep the fires burning brightly, to keep a good head of steam up, when every turn of the propeller was taking them nearer and nearer to a prisoner of war camp. We were asking quite a lot of them to do this. It was rather like asking a French aristocrat in the time of this French Revolution and saying to them, do you mind driving your own tumbril this morning? We're a bit short-handed. But something had to be done about it. So I went along to the chief engineer's cabin. He was asleep in his bunk. I woke him up. I told him the ship's speed had gone down to 4 knots, and he'd better do something about it. And he lay in his bunk, and he said it wasn't his duty to get the ship into Freetown. It was his duty to sink the ship, and he wasn't going to do anything about it. So now I had got something which I'd been secretly dreading ever since I'd been aboard her. I'd got direct confrontation. Not exactly eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation, because he was lying on his back in his bunk, but still direct confrontation. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do, and I remember that moment so well, looking down at him as he lay in his bunk, thinking, well, what can I do? Do I shoot you? Could I shoot you? And I didn't know the answer to either of those two questions. But suddenly he flew out of his bunk. That's the only way to describe it. He just flew out of his bunk, and just as he was, in his pajamas, ran down the engine room, followed by me. If anyone had been watching, it would probably looked a bit funny. It would look as if I was chasing him down, but I wasn't. I was only following him down. Anyhow, down in the engine room, back into the boiler room, and then he started yelling at the firemen, who got up off their backsides and started cleaning out the fires, shoveling in more coal, and gradually the steam pressure went up, the revolutions went up, and we finally were on our way to Freetown once again. And so we arrived in Freetown, and it was a rather thrilling and very rewarding experience for me to bring Ewan Fells, my very first command, into Freetown Harbour. And as we came in to this big convoy assembly harbour, all the assembled merchant ships and Royal Navy ships lined the railings as we went by, still listing quite a bit because I never got all the water out, but with the white ensign proudly flying above the German swastika. They all cheered us as we went by and passed them, and so we dropped anchor at the head of the at the top of the harbour. And that brings me to the end of my little story, and I do hope I haven't bored you.